The gunshot cracked through the silence of Cottonwood Springs, Colorado, in 1878. But it wasn't the sound that turned heads, it was the woman who fired it. Cassidy Fairchild stood trembling in the town square, her smoking pistol pointed at the sky, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face as she demanded the return of what was rightfully hers. The townsfolk gathered around her like vultures circling a wounded animal, their whispers cutting through the autumn air more sharply than the October chill. "I said I want my land back," Cassidy repeated, her voice steadier than her hands. At 24, she had already weathered more storms than most faced in a lifetime. Her once prosperous family ranch had been stolen through forged documents while she nursed her dying father, and now she stood alone, cast out from the only home she'd ever known. Sheriff Mills stepped forward, his weathered face a mask of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Fairchild, we've been through this. The paperwork is legal. Hargrove's got the deed fair and square." "There was nothing fair about it," she spat, lowering the gun finally. Her honey-brown hair had fallen loose from its pins, framing a face that would have been beautiful if not for the hardness that had settled into her features over the past month. "My father never signed those papers. He could barely hold a spoon in his last days, let alone a pen." From the edge of the crowd, Darby Abernathy watched with interest. He'd ridden into Cottonwood Springs just 3 days prior, looking for nothing but a quiet place to winter his cattle before moving on. At 30, Darby had seen his share of frontier injustice, but something about the lone woman standing defiantly against the entire town stirred something within him that he thought had long since died. "She's making a spectacle of herself again," muttered a woman beside him, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Third time this week." "She's not wanted anymore," her companion agreed with a nod. "Not since she accused the most respected businessman in town of forgery. She'd do well to move on before something worse happens to her." Darby's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough about Vernon Hargrove in his short time in town to form his own opinions, none of them favorable. The businessman had a stranglehold on Cottonwood Springs, with fingers in every profitable venture from the bank to the mines. Sheriff Mills was trying to usher Cassidy away now, his hand firmly on her arm. "Come along, Miss Fairchild. I won't lock you up this time, but I can't have you disturbing the peace." "Peace," she laughed bitterly. "What peace is there when thieves walk free and honest folk lose everything?" Something in her voice, the raw determination beneath the desperation, made Darby step forward. "Excuse me, Sheriff," he called, his deep voice carrying across the square. The crowd parted as he approached, his tall frame and the confident way he carried himself commanding attention. "I believe the lady has a legitimate grievance." The sheriff turned, surprise evident on his face at the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. The name's Darby Abernathy," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "and I've got business with Miss Fairchild here." Cassidy looked at him with suspicion, her red-rimmed eyes narrowing. "I don't know you." "Not yet," Darby agreed with a slight nod, "but I've been looking to buy some cattle and I heard the Fairchild stock was the finest in the county, was hoping to discuss terms." The lie rolled off his tongue smoothly, but it had the desired effect. The sheriff's grip on Cassidy's arm loosened as confusion crossed his face. "Fairchild doesn't have any stock left," one of the onlookers called out. "Hargrove's got it all. She's not wanted anymore," another voice chimed in, echoing what Darby had heard earlier. "No ranch, no cattle, no business." Darby's blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, found the speaker in the crowd. "She's all I've ever wanted to do business with," he replied firmly. "My father always said to seek out the Fairchilds if I was ever in Colorado, said their word was as good as gold." The mention of her family's reputation brought a flash of pride to Cassidy's face, momentarily displacing the desperation. Darby could see she was weighing him up, trying to determine if he was friend or foe in a town that had clearly turned against her. "Sheriff, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak with Miss Fairchild privately about a business matter," Darby continued smoothly. Perhaps over at the hotel restaurant, before the sheriff could object, Darby had offered his arm to Cassidy. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her chin lifting defiantly as she faced the crowd. "We can talk," she said to Darby, though her tone made it clear she wasn't convinced of his intentions. "But I've got nothing left to sell you, Mr. Abernathy." As they walked away from the dispersing crowd, Darby leaned down slightly. "I don't actually want to buy cattle," he murmured, "but I do want to hear your side of the story. Something doesn't sit right with me about this town." Cassidy's steps faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Why would you care? Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people stand aside and let the powerful take what they want," he replied, his voice carrying an edge of personal experience. "And I don't much care for it." The hotel restaurant was nearly empty as they took a table near the back. Cassidy sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Pride was all she had left, and she clung to it fiercely. "So," Darby said once they were settled, "tell me what really happened to your ranch." For a long moment, Cassidy just studied him, trying to determine his motives. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-weathered skin and lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the distance. His dark hair was a touch too long, curling slightly at the collar of his shirt, and a well-maintained beard framed his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clear blue and direct, with none of the shifty evasiveness she'd come to expect from the men in town. "My father fell ill 6 months ago," she finally began, her voice low. "Consumption. I was caring for him day and night while trying to keep the ranch running. We had hired hands, good men, but one by one, Hargrove lured them away with promises of better pay at his mining operation." Darby nodded, listening intently as she continued. 3 weeks before my father died, Hargrove came to the house. Said he wanted to offer his condolences and discuss easing my burden. He suggested I sell the ranch to him." Her lip curled in disgust. "When I refused, he seemed to accept it graciously enough. But the day after my father's funeral, he showed up with the sheriff and a deed transferring ownership of the Fairchild Ranch to him, supposedly signed by my father." "And your father couldn't have signed it?" Darby asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Cassidy's eyes flashed. "My father could barely speak in those final weeks, let alone hold a pen, and even if he could have, he would never have sold our land. The Fairchilds have been on that ranch for 3 generations. It was everything to him." "And to you?" Darby asked softly. "It's all I have," she whispered, a crack in her composure showing for just a moment before she squared her shoulders again. Darby was silent for a moment, processing her story. It was a tale as old as the frontier itself, the powerful preying on the vulnerable, using the letter of the law while violating its spirit. "What about the hired hands who left? Would any of them testify that your father was too ill to sign documents?" Cassidy shook her head. "Most have moved on to Hargrove's mines in the mountains. The few who might have spoken up mysteriously found themselves in trouble with the law and were encouraged to leave town." She gave a bitter smile. "Sheriff Mills is firmly in Hargrove's pocket, and the judge rides circuit. Won't be back through for another month." Her fingers twisted together. "By then, Hargrove will have cleared the land and started building whatever he has planned. There won't be anything left of my home to save." Darby leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the problem. He'd intended to stay in Cottonwood Springs just long enough to rest his horses and resupply before continuing south. Getting involved in a local dispute was the last thing he'd planned, especially against someone as powerful as Hargrove seemed to be. But there was something about Cassidy Fairchild that stirred his sense of justice. Perhaps it was the echo of his own past losses, or maybe it was simply the fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished despite everything she'd endured. "Where are you staying now?" he asked. Cassidy's cheeks flushed slightly. "I've been sleeping in the church. Father Thomas lets me use a back room. I work for my keep cleaning, helping with the orphans who live there." "And your plans?" She lifted her chin. "I'm going to get my ranch back, Mr. Abernathy. I don't know how yet, but I will. That land is rightfully mine, and I won't let Hargrove steal it from my family's legacy." Darby nodded slowly, a decision forming in his mind. "Miss Fairchild, I might be able to help you. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with men like Hargrove before." Sometimes they need to be reminded that not everyone can be bought or frightened away. Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly tamped down by caution. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Let's just say I recognize injustice when I see it, he replied. And I've got some time before I need to be moving on. Before Cassidy could respond, the restaurant door swung open and 3 men entered. The lead man, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the frontier town, stopped short when he spotted them. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Miss Fairchild, I see you found a new ear to bend with your tales." Cassidy stiffened, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. "Mr. Hargrove," she acknowledged coldly. Darby assessed the man approaching their table. Vernon Hargrove was in his late 40s, with the soft hands and slight paunch of a man who directed labor rather than performed it. His mustache was meticulously groomed, and a gold watch chain gleamed across his vest. "I don't believe we've met," Hargrove said, extending a hand to Darby. "Vernon Hargrove, I own most of the businesses in Cottonwood Springs." Darby stood slowly, taking the offered hand with a grip just firm enough to make the other man wince slightly. "Darby Abernathy, just passing through." "Well, Mr. Abernathy, I feel I should warn you Miss Fairchild here has been spreading some rather inflammatory accusations about me. The ravings of a grief-stricken mind, I'm afraid." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The poor girl simply can't accept that her father chose to sell their struggling ranch before he passed." "Funny," Darby replied, not releasing Hargrove's hand. "She doesn't strike me as the raving type, more the determined sort who knows exactly what she's talking about." Hargrove's smile tightened as he pulled his hand free. "You do well to be careful about the company you keep in Cottonwood Springs, Mr. Abernathy. Some associations can make a man stay here, uncomfortable." "Is that a threat?" Darby asked mildly, though his posture had subtly shifted to one of readiness. Simply friendly advice. Hargrove adjusted his cuffs. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my associates and I have business to discuss." He gestured to a table across the room, dismissing them. Darby remained standing, his gaze level. "We were just finishing up ourselves. Miss Fairchild has agreed to show me her father's grave. I always like to pay my respects to the family of potential business partners." Cassidy looked up at him in surprise but quickly recovered. "Yes, we should be going. The light will be fading soon." As they walked out of the restaurant, Darby could feel Hargrove's eyes boring into his back. Once outside, Cassidy released a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not many people in town are willing to stand up to him like that." "Where is your father buried?" Darby asked. "On the ranch," she replied, a shadow passing over her face. "Our family plot is on a small rise overlooking the valley. It's the one place Hargrove can't legally touch. Family burial grounds are protected by law." Darby nodded thoughtfully. "Then let's go there. I'd like to see the ranch, and it seems like a good excuse to look around without arousing too much suspicion." Cassidy hesitated. "Hargrove has men watching the property. He claims it's to protect his investment, but really it's to keep me away." "All the more reason for us to go," Darby said with a grim smile. "I want to see exactly what we're dealing with." Cassidy searched his face. "Mr. Abernathy, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't your fight. Hargrove is dangerous. He's ruined people for less than what you just did." "Miss Fairchild," Darby replied, his voice softening slightly, "in my experience, men like Hargrove only get away with their schemes because good people feel too alone to fight back. You're not alone anymore." Something shifted in Cassidy's expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the first fragile seed of hope. She nodded once, decisively. "All right, Mr. Abernathy, let's ride out to the Fairchild Ranch." As they made their way to the livery stable where Darby had left his horse, neither noticed the man who slipped out of the hotel after them, hurrying toward Hargrove's office with news of their plans. The Fairchild Ranch lay 3 miles outside of town, nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising in the distance. As they approached on horseback, Cassidy riding behind Darby on his sturdy gelding, the first thing that struck him was how prime the land was. Clear water, good grazing, and positioned perfectly along the trade route to the mining camps in the mountains. No wonder Hargrove wanted it. There, Cassidy said softly, pointing to a cluster of buildings in the distance. That's home. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings surrounded it, a large barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and what appeared to be a forge. It spoke of generations of careful building and prosperity. It's beautiful, Darby said honestly. Your family built something fine here. As they drew closer, Cassidy tensed behind him. There, she whispered. By the corral, that's one of Hargrove's men. Darby spotted the man leaning against the fence, rifle propped beside him. He was watching their approach with obvious interest, straightening up as they came within hailing distance. That's far enough, the man called out, his hand moving to rest on his rifle. This is private property. Darby reined in his horse, feeling Cassidy's hands tighten around his waist. We're here to visit the Fairchild family plot, he called back. Miss Fairchild wants to pay her respects to her father. The guard hesitated, clearly not having expected this explanation. I got orders not to let anybody on the property, especially her. He jerked his chin toward Cassidy. The law's clear on this, Darby replied firmly. Family burial grounds remain accessible to kin, regardless of property ownership. You're welcome to accompany us to ensure we don't disturb anything else. The man frowned, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. Fine. But I'll be watching every move, and you leave straight after. Much obliged, Darby said with a tip of his hat, urging his horse forward again. Cassidy directed him past the main house toward a small fenced area on a gentle rise about 100 yards away. A grove of cottonwood trees provided shade over the graves, their leaves golden in the autumn light. He's watching us, Cassidy murmured as Darby helped her down from the horse. Let him, Darby replied quietly. Act like you're just here to mourn. But keep your eyes open. I want to know exactly how many men Hargrove has stationed here and what they're doing. The family plot was small but well tended, with about a dozen markers ranging from ancient to recent. The newest grave, still showing signs of recently disturbed earth, bore a simple wooden cross with Edward Fairchild carved into it. Cassidy knelt beside it, genuine grief overtaking her features as she touched the soil. I'm sorry, Papa, she whispered. I'm trying. Darby stood respectfully to the side, giving her a moment while using the opportunity to survey the property. Besides the man who had stopped them, he could see another figure moving near the barn and what appeared to be smoke rising from the chimney of the main house. Someone's living in the house, he asked quietly when Cassidy rose to her feet again. She nodded, her jaw tight. Hargrove moved his foreman in immediately. The rest of his men come and go. They've been taking inventory of everything, preparing to auction off the equipment and livestock. Her voice caught. Our horses are already gone, sold to a buyer from Denver. Darby's expression darkened. He's moving fast. He wants to erase any trace of the Fairchilds before anyone can question his claim, Cassidy said bitterly. In another week, there will be nothing left to fight for. They stood in silence for a moment, the autumn wind rustling through the cottonwood leaves above them. Darby's mind was working, piecing together what he'd seen and heard. Is there anything on the property that might prove the deed is a forgery? He asked suddenly. Business records, your father's real signature for comparison? Hope flashed across Cassidy's face. Papa kept all important papers in a lockbox under a floorboard in his bedroom, account books, deeds, everything. I doubt Hargrove's men have found it's well hidden. And if we could get those papers, we might have a chance of proving the forgery when the circuit judge returns, she said, her voice growing stronger. But how would we get into the house? They're watching day and night. Darby glanced toward the main house, an idea forming. Tonight, he said decisively. We'll come back tonight. As dusk fell over Cottonwood Springs, Darby and Cassidy finalized their plan in the small back room of the church where she had been staying. Father Thomas, a sympathetic elderly priest, had provided them with a simple meal and discreetly left them to their discussion. The moon's nearly full, Darby noted, peering out the small window. Not ideal, but we can use the shadows of the buildings for cover. Cassidy nodded, her face set with determination. She had changed into darker clothing, a simple black skirt and blouse that had once belonged to her mother. "I've been watching the house from a distance. They usually have 2 men on guard, one near the house and one patrolling the perimeter. They change shifts at midnight." "That's our window then," Darby said. "During the changeover, there's always a few minutes of confusion, especially if the men aren't professional guards." He spread out a rough sketch of the property that Cassidy had drawn. "We'll approach from the west, using the creek bed for cover. You said your father's bedroom is on the first floor at the back of the house." "Yes, there's a window that faces the orchard. It was often left open in summer, but they'll have closed it by now with the colder weather." Darby nodded thoughtfully. "I can get it open. Once we're inside, how long will it take you to find the lockbox?" "Not long. I know exactly where it is." Cassidy's fingers traced the map nervously. "What if they've already found it?" "Then we'll need another plan," Darby admitted. "But let's cross that bridge if we come to it." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of what they were about to attempt settling over them. "Why are you doing this?" Cassidy asked suddenly, her eyes searching his face. "You could be shot or arrested. You don't even know me." Darby was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 19, my family lost everything to a man like Hargrove," he finally said, his voice low. "My father wasn't as strong as yours. He took his own life rather than face the shame. My mother followed 6 months later from grief." His eyes, when they met hers, held a pain that echoed her own. "I walked away then. I've regretted it every day since." Cassidy reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said, his fingers turning to grasp hers briefly. "Just know that I understand what's at stake for you. This isn't just about land, it's about justice and legacy." The connection between them in that moment transcended their short acquaintance, a recognition of shared wounds and determination. For the first time since her father's death, Cassidy felt the crushing weight of her solitary fight lighten, if only slightly. "We should rest for a few hours," Darby suggested, gently withdrawing his hand. "We'll leave at 11. The night was clear and cold as they made their way toward the Fairchild ranch on foot, having left Darby's horse tethered at a safe distance. The moon cast long shadows across the landscape, both a blessing and a curse as they utilized the darkness while remaining wary of its revealing light. They moved in silence, Cassidy leading the way along the creek bed that cut through the western edge of the property. The water was shallow this time of year, allowing them to wade when necessary to avoid leaving tracks on the banks. As they drew closer to the house, Darby touched Cassidy's arm, pointing to a glowing cigarette ember near the barn. One guard, just as she had predicted. They crouched lower, continuing their careful approach until they reached the cover of the apple orchard behind the house. "There," Cassidy whispered, indicating a window on the ground floor. "That's Father's room." Darby assessed the distance from their position to the window, about 30 yards of open ground. "Wait here," he murmured. "I'll check if the coast is clear and signal you." Before she could protest, he was moving, keeping low and using the moonlit shadows to conceal his progress. Cassidy watched with her heart in her throat as he reached the side of the house, pressing himself against the weathered boards as he edged toward the window. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned and beckoned to her. Taking a deep breath, Cassidy darted across the open space, her skirts gathered in one hand to prevent them from rustling against the dry grass. "The latch is simple," Darby whispered as she reached him. "I can get it open, but we'll need to be quick and quiet once we're inside." He produced a thin knife from his boot and slipped it between the window frames, working it carefully until the latch gave way with a soft click. Slowly, he eased the window up, wincing at a slight squeak from the rarely used hinges. They froze, listening for any sign that the noise had been detected. When only cricket chirps and the distant hoot of an owl answered, Darby lifted the window the rest of the way and helped Cassidy climb through before following her. The room was dark and musty, the air stale from disuse. Moonlight filtering through the window revealed a large 4-poster bed, a dresser, and a writing desk, all covered in a fine layer of dust. It appeared Hargrove's men had left Edward Fairchild's personal quarters untouched, perhaps out of superstition or simple lack of interest. "Where's the floorboard?" Darby asked in a barely audible whisper. Cassidy moved to the far corner of the room, kneeling beside the bed. "Here," she breathed, her fingers feeling along the floor until they found what they were seeking. "Help me move the bed slightly." Together, they shifted the heavy bed frame just enough to access the loose floorboard beneath. Cassidy worked her fingers into a small gap, lifting the board to reveal a hollow space beneath. Relief washed over her face as she reached in and extracted a metal box about the size of a large book. "It's still here," she whispered triumphantly. The sound of boots on the porch outside froze them both. Voices drifted through the closed bedroom door, men talking as they entered the house. "Told Hargrove we saw them at the cemetery today," one was saying. "He wants us to search the property again tomorrow, make sure they didn't leave anything behind." "Waste of time," another voice replied. "That Fairchild girl's got nothing left, just causing trouble because she can't accept her old man sold out." Darby motioned urgently toward the window. Clutching the lockbox to her chest, Cassidy moved quickly across the room while he held the window for her. She was halfway through when a floorboard creaked loudly beneath her weight. The voices in the house went silent. "You hear that?" one of the men asked. "Check the back rooms," the other replied, footsteps approaching the bedroom door. Cassidy scrambled through the window, Darby right behind her. They had barely closed it when the bedroom door opened, a lantern casting light into the previously dark space. "Run!" Darby hissed, pushing Cassidy toward the orchard as a shout went up behind them. "Intruders, back of the house!" They sprinted across the open ground, the lockbox clutched tightly in Cassidy's arms. The orchard offered minimal cover as they heard men pouring out of the house, lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they gave chase. "The creek," Cassidy gasped, veering toward the water. "We can lose them there." A shot rang out, the bullet thudding into a tree trunk inches from Darby's head. He ducked lower, reaching back to grasp Cassidy's free hand as they ran, helping her keep pace. They splashed into the creek, the cold water a shock against their heated skin. Darby led them downstream, moving as quickly as the rocky bed would allow without causing them to fall. "They're in the creek," a voice shouted in the distance behind them. "Circle around to cut them off." Darby pulled Cassidy toward the opposite bank. "We need to leave the water," he said urgently. "They'll be expecting us to follow it all the way down." They scrambled up the muddy bank, crouching in the brush as they caught their breath. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, but the searchers were still following the creek. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile east of here," Cassidy whispered. "No one's used it for years. We might be able to hide there until morning." Darby nodded, and they set off again, moving more carefully now through the dense underbrush. The shouts of Hargrove's men grew fainter as they changed direction, heading away from both the creek and the path back to town. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a one-room shack nestled against a rocky hillside. The roof sagged in one corner and the door hung askew on rusted hinges, but it offered shelter from both the night air and prying eyes. "No one will think to look for us here," Cassidy said as they slipped inside. "It's been abandoned since Old Man Jennings died 5 years ago." Darby secured the door as best he could while Cassidy felt her way to a small stone fireplace on the far wall. "We shouldn't risk a fire," she said, setting the lockbox down carefully. "The light might be seen." "Agreed," Darby replied, moving to her side. "We'll have to wait until morning to examine the contents." They settled on the dusty floorboards, backs against the wall, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. The cabin was cold, and Cassidy shivered in her damp clothing. Without a word, Darby removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Can't have you catching pneumonia," he said quietly. "Not when we're so close to getting your proof." Cassidy clutched the coat gratefully around herself. "Thank you for everything." In the dim moonlight filtering through the cabin's single grimy window, they sat in companionable silence, the shared danger creating a bond that neither had expected. Eventually, Cassidy's head drooped against Darby's shoulder as exhaustion claimed her. He remained alert, listening to the night sounds and the soft rhythm of her breathing, his mind turning over their next moves. The lockbox might contain the evidence they needed, but using it effectively against a man with Hargrove's influence would require careful planning. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Darby gently woke Cassidy. "Time to see what we've got," he said, nodding toward the lockbox. She straightened, instantly alert despite the few hours of uncomfortable sleep. Pulling the box onto her lap, she produced a small key from a chain around her neck. "I've carried this since Papa fell ill," she explained, inserting it into the lock. "He made me promise to keep it with me always." The lid creaked open to reveal a neatly organized collection of papers, deeds, bank records, and personal correspondence. Cassidy rifled through them with practiced hands, pulling out several documents. "Here," she said triumphantly, holding up a sheet of paper. "This is the original deed to the ranch, signed by my grandfather and countersigned by my father when he inherited it." She pulled out another document. "And these are letters Papa wrote to our cattle buyers just 2 months ago. You can see his signature clearly." Darby examined the documents carefully. Even to his untrained eye, the difference between Edward Fairchild's actual signature and what must have been on Hargrove's forged deed was likely significant. "We'll need to get these to someone who can verify the forgery," he said thoughtfully. "Someone Hargrove can't intimidate or bribe." "The circuit judge," Cassidy replied immediately. "Judge Hollister is known for his integrity. When he returns next month, we can't wait that long," Darby interrupted gently. "Hargrove will have dismantled everything by then. We need to act sooner." Cassidy's face fell momentarily before determination returned to her features. "What do you suggest?" "The territorial marshal in Denver," Darby said after a moment's consideration. "Forgery of land deeds is a federal offense. If we can get these documents to him, he can issue an injunction stopping all activity on the property until the case is heard." Hope bloomed in Cassidy's eyes. "Denver is only 2 days' ride. And Hargrove won't expect us to go there," Darby added. "He'll be looking for us closer to home, thinking we'll try to rally support in town." "We should leave immediately," Cassidy said, already gathering the papers back into the box. "Hargrove's men will be searching everywhere once daylight comes." Darby nodded in agreement, but a thoughtful expression crossed his face. "Before we go, there's something else we should consider. Hargrove moved awfully fast after your father's death, almost as if he'd been planning this for some time." "What are you suggesting?" "That the forged deed might not be his only crime," Darby said carefully. "Men like him usually have patterns. If we could find others he's cheated." Understanding dawned on Cassidy's face. "Strength in numbers, exactly." "Do you know of anyone else who might have lost land or business to Hargrove under suspicious circumstances?" Cassidy thought for a moment. "The Wilsons lost their mining claim last year, and old Mrs. Tanner had to sell her boarding house for far less than it was worth. There were rumors that Hargrove threatened to have her son arrested on trumped-up charges if she didn't sell." "That's a start," Darby said, rising to his feet. "Let's get to Denver and set the legal wheels in motion, then we can work on building a stronger case." They slipped out of the cabin as the sunrise painted the eastern sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Moving cautiously, they made their way back to where Darby had left his horse, finding the animal grazing contentedly, undisturbed. "We'll need another horse," Darby noted as he checked his mount's saddle. "Mine can carry us both for a while, but not all the way to Denver. There's a wild Mustang herd that grazes in the North Valley," Cassidy suggested. "I've gentled horses from that herd before, if we could catch one." Darby raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You break wild horses?" A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he'd seen. "My mother was half Ute. She taught me their ways with horses before she died. I can gentle a Mustang faster than most men can break one." Something shifted in Darby's perception of her, then an added layer of respect for this woman who had already impressed him with her courage and determination. "Well then, Miss Fairchild, let's go catch you a horse." The North Valley lay beyond Cottonwood Springs, away from the direction of the Fairchild Ranch. As they rode double on Darby's gelding, they kept to the tree line, avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted from a distance. There, Cassidy murmured after they had ridden for nearly an hour, pointing toward a grassy meadow where a small herd of mustangs grazed. About 15 horses, mostly mares and yearlings. Darby studied the animals with an experienced eye. They look healthy, strong legs, good conformation. The dun mare at the edge of the group, Cassidy said, indicating a golden-colored horse with a black mane and tail. She's young but mature enough to ride hard, and she's curious to see how she watches us. Indeed, the mare had lifted her head, ears pricked forward as she regarded the humans observing her herd. While the other horses continued grazing, she took a few steps in their direction before stopping, nostrils flaring as she caught their scent. "How do you plan to catch her?" Darby asked. Cassidy slid from behind him. "I need your bandana," she said, holding out her hand. Darby untied the blue cloth from around his neck and handed it to her. She knotted it around her own neck, then removed her boots. "Stay here with your horse," she instructed. "I'll work my way around to the far side of the herd, then drive them toward you. The dun will likely break away from the others, they usually do. When she does, use your lasso to create a barrier, not to catch her. I'll do the rest." Before Darby could question her further, Cassidy was moving, barefoot and silent, making a wide circle through the trees to position herself behind the grazing herd. He watched in fascination as she disappeared from view, only to reappear several minutes later on the far side of the meadow. What happened next astonished him. Rather than charging at the horses to scatter them, Cassidy began to sing a low, melodic chant that carried across the quiet valley. The mustangs lifted their heads, ears swiveling toward the sound. She moved forward slowly, still singing, her arms extended slightly from her sides. The herd shifted nervously but didn't immediately flee. The dun mare actually took a step toward her before the stallion leading the herd snorted a warning. When Cassidy suddenly clapped her hands and shouted, the spell was broken. The herd bolted, racing across the meadow toward where Darby waited. As she had predicted, the dun mare separated slightly from the others, running along the edge of the group. Darby uncoiled his lasso but didn't throw it. Instead, when the mare approached, he swung it in a wide arc, creating a visual barrier that caused her to veer away from the herd. In the split second of her confusion, Cassidy appeared, running directly at the horse. Instinctively, the mare stopped, rearing slightly as Cassidy approached. Instead of grabbing for her, Cassidy began her song again, reaching up slowly to touch the horse's muzzle with gentle fingers. The mare trembled but didn't bolt as Cassidy removed the bandana from her neck and looped it carefully around the horse's neck, creating a makeshift halter. For several long moments, woman and horse regarded each other, a silent communication passing between them. Then, incredibly, Cassidy moved to the mare's side and placed a hand on her back. The horse shifted nervously but allowed the touch. In one fluid motion, Cassidy vaulted onto the bare back of the Mustang. The mare pranced sideways, tossing her head but didn't buck or bolt. Slowly, Cassidy guided the horse toward Darby, using only the pressure of her legs and gentle tugs on the bandana. That was. Darby shook his head in amazement as they approached. "I've never seen anything like it." Cassidy patted the mare's neck affectionately. "She's young and curious. The older ones are much harder to convince." She stroked the golden coat. "She'll do fine for our journey, though we'll need to find a proper bridle in Denver." Darby couldn't help but smile at the picture they made the determined young woman sitting proudly atop the wild horse she'd gentled in minutes. "Miss Fairchild, you are full of surprises." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "We should move on. Hargrove's men will be widening their search by now." With Cassidy mounted on the dun mare and Darby on his gelding, they made good time, avoiding the main roads and keeping to less traveled paths through the foothills. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Cottonwood Springs. "We'll need supplies," Darby noted as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream. "Food, water, and something more substantial for your horse than that makeshift halter." "There's a trading post about 10 miles ahead," Cassidy replied, splashing water on her face. "Run by a half-Cheyenne man named Thomas Blue Wolf. He's no friend of Hargrove's. The trading post sits on land Hargrove has wanted for years." "Can he be trusted?" Cassidy nodded confidently. He was a friend of my father's. He'll help us if he can. The trading post appeared around mid-afternoon, a sturdy log building with a wide porch, situated at a crossroads between two valleys. Several horses were hitched outside, suggesting other travelers were present. "We should be cautious," Darby said, reining in at the edge of the clearing. "Word travels fast, and Hargrove might have sent riders ahead to watch the routes out of town." Cassidy surveyed the scene. "I'll go in first. Blue Wolf knows me, and I can assess who else is inside without drawing attention. You stay with the horses, ready to leave quickly if necessary." Darby frowned, not liking the idea of her entering alone, but her logic was sound. "Be careful," he said. "If anything seems wrong, come out immediately." She slipped from the mare's back, adjusting her skirts and using her fingers to comb through her tangled hair. Despite the rough night and morning's adventure, she carried herself with dignity as she approached the trading post. Darby watched, one hand resting on his holstered revolver, as she climbed the steps and disappeared inside. The minutes ticked by, his tension growing with each passing moment. Just as he was considering following her, the door opened, and Cassidy emerged with a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying black hair. She beckoned to Darby, and he led the horses forward, studying the man beside her. Thomas Blue Wolf had the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors, with deep-set dark eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Abernathy," Cassidy called as he approached, "this is Thomas Blue Wolf. He's willing to help us." Blue Wolf extended a hand as Darby dismounted. "Any friend of the Fairchilds is welcome here," he said, his voice deep and accented. "Cassidy tells me Hargrove has finally shown his true colors." "He has," Darby confirmed, shaking the offered hand. "We're headed to Denver to seek help from the territorial marshal, but we need supplies for the journey." Blue Wolf nodded grimly. "Come inside, we have much to discuss, and it's best not done in the open." Inside, the trading post was a treasure trove of goods, tools, clothing, foodstuffs, and equipment for every imaginable frontier need. A young woman, presumably Blue Wolf's daughter, minded the counter while two grizzled trappers examined rifles in one corner. Blue Wolf led them to a small room at the back, closing the door for privacy. "Hargrove's men were here this morning," he said without preamble, "asking if I'd seen either of you. They claimed you had stolen valuable property from Hargrove's ranch." Cassidy's hand went instinctively to the lockbox, which she had wrapped in a cloth and carried in a small satchel. "The only thing I've taken is what was rightfully mine to begin with." "I told them I had seen nothing," Blue Wolf continued, "but they will return." "Hargrove is not a man who gives up easily, especially when his pride is wounded." "Did they say which way they were headed after leaving here?" Darby asked. "South, toward Brenner's Pass. They believe you might try to reach the railroad that way." Blue Wolf's shrewd eyes assessed them. "But you plan to go directly to Denver, yes? The more difficult route through the high country," Darby nodded. "It's longer but less likely to be watched. A wise choice." Blue Wolf moved to a large chest in the corner of the room. "You will need proper supplies. The weather in the high passes can turn quickly this time of year." As he spoke, he began pulling out items: heavy blankets, dried meat, coffee, and hardtack. He added a good leather halter and reins for Cassidy's mare, a small cooking pot, and 2 canteens. "I cannot give you much," he said apologetically, "but this will help you reach Denver safely." "We can pay," Darby began, reaching for his money pouch, but Blue Wolf held up a hand. "No, consider it payment of a debt. Edward Fairchild once saved my daughter's life when she fell through ice on the winter hunt. I could never repay him in life. Perhaps I can help his daughter in his absence." Cassidy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Thomas. My father always spoke highly of your friendship." Blue Wolf nodded, then turned to a map spread on a small table. "You should avoid the main trails. Here," he traced a line with his finger, "is an old hunting path that will take you through the eastern ridges. It is longer but safer from prying eyes. You can reach Denver in 3 days if you push hard." As they studied the map together, Blue Wolf's daughter entered with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a plate of cornbread. "Eat," Blue Wolf insisted. "The journey ahead will require strength." While they ate, Cassidy shared their plans to gather evidence against Hargrove from others he had wronged. Blue Wolf listened thoughtfully, then said, "I may be able to help with that as well. Many who pass through here have tales of Hargrove's dealings. I will compile what I know and send it to you in Denver with my next supply wagon." "That would be invaluable," Darby said, impressed by the trader's willingness to involve himself in their cause. "One thing more," Blue Wolf added, his expression grave. "There are rumors that Hargrove did not act alone in his schemes. Some say he has a partner in Denver, someone with connections in the territorial government who helps ensure his land grabs go unchallenged." Cassidy and Darby exchanged concerned glances. "Do you know who?" Cassidy asked. Blue Wolf shook his head. "Only whispers, no name, but be cautious when you reach the city. Not all who wear badges can be trusted." The warning cast a shadow over their plans, but it also reinforced the importance of their mission. If Hargrove's influence extended to Denver, they would need to be even more careful about whom they approached with their evidence. As they prepared to leave, Blue Wolf pressed a small leather pouch into Cassidy's hand. "Herbs," he explained, "for healing and for strength. My mother's people have used them for generations." "Your kindness will not be forgotten," Cassidy promised, embracing the older man. "Just bring justice to Hargrove," he replied. "That will be payment enough." With their horses rested and their supplies replenished, they set off again, following Blue Wolf's directions toward the high country trail. The afternoon sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows across the landscape as they rode. "We should make camp before nightfall," Darby suggested as they began to climb into more rugged terrain. "Find somewhere defensible in case Hargrove's men are closer than we think." Cassidy nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There's something I've been wondering about," she said after a moment. "You said you were just passing through Cottonwood Springs. Where were you headed?" Darby was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "South," he finally answered. "I have a small spread in New Mexico territory, nothing fancy, just enough land for a decent herd and a simple life." "Alone?" The question slipped out before Cassidy could stop it, and she immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." A faint smile touched Darby's lips. "Yes, alone. After what happened to my family, I kept to myself. Easier that way." "And yet here you are, risking everything to help a stranger." Darby glanced at her, their eyes meeting briefly before he looked away again. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said quietly, "or maybe I just couldn't stand by and watch history repeat itself." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep in Cassidy. In the short time she'd known him, Darby Abernathy had shown more integrity and compassion than most men she'd known her entire life. Despite the danger they faced, she found herself grateful for his presence, not just for his help, but for the quiet strength he offered when she needed it most. As the sun dipped below the western mountains, they found a suitable campsite in a small clearing sheltered by a rocky outcropping. A stream gurgled nearby, providing water for themselves and the horses. While Darby gathered wood for a small, well-concealed fire, Cassidy tended to the horses, using her gentle touch to reassure the dun mare that had carried her faithfully through the day. The bond between them was already forming something that would normally take weeks, happening in a matter of hours due to their shared journey. "She needs a name," Cassidy mused as Darby returned with an armload of firewood. "What are you thinking?" he asked, arranging the wood carefully. Cassidy stroked the mare's golden neck. "Esperanza," she decided. "It means hope in Spanish, something we could all use a little more of right now." Darby nodded approvingly. "It suits her." As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal of Blue Wolf's provisions, sitting close to the small fire for warmth. The night was clear, stars appearing one by one in the vast expanse above them. In the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing through the mountains. "I've been thinking about what Blue Wolf said," Cassidy said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the growing chill. "About Hargrove having a partner in Denver. It makes sense. He's always seemed to have information and influence beyond what a man in his position should have." Darby nodded thoughtfully. "It complicates things. We'll need to be careful about who we approach first when we reach the city." I know a lawyer there, Cassidy offered. James Foster. He handled some business for my father years ago. If anyone would know who can be trusted in the territorial offices, it would be him. Good. We'll seek him out first, then decide how to proceed with the marshal. Darby stoked the fire gently, sending sparks dancing upward. We should get some rest. Dawn comes early in the mountains, and we have a long ride ahead. They arranged their blankets on opposite sides of the fire, each lost in their own thoughts as sleep slowly claimed them. The last thing Cassidy saw before her eyes closed was Darby's profile, strong and steady in the flickering firelight, and she felt a sense of security she hadn't known since before her father fell ill. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm of hard riding, brief rests, and wary vigilance. The trail grew steeper and more challenging as they climbed into the high country, winding through dense pine forests and across windswept ridges. They encountered no other travelers, which was both a relief and a source of unease. It meant Hargrove's men hadn't found their trail, but also that they were truly alone if anything went wrong. By the evening of the third day, they crested a final rise and saw Denver spread before them in the valley below a growing city of wooden buildings and stone structures, smoke rising from countless chimneys as the autumn chill settled over the frontier capital. "We made it," Cassidy breathed, a mixture of relief and apprehension in her voice. "The hard part's just beginning," Darby reminded her gently. "Finding justice in a city where we don't know who to trust won't be easy." They approached Denver as dusk fell, blending with the steady stream of travelers entering the city for the night. The streets were busy with wagons, horsemen, and pedestrians, the saloons and hotels doing brisk business as miners, cowboys, and businessmen sought entertainment after a day's work. "We need a place to stay," Darby said as they rode down the main street, "somewhere not too prominent but respectable enough that we won't draw unwanted attention." Cassidy pointed toward a modest 3-story building several blocks from the busiest section of town, the Westward Hotel. "My father and I stayed there when we came to Denver on business. The owner is a widow named Mrs. Holloway, fair prices and clean rooms." The Westward proved to be a sensible choice, neither too shabby nor too luxurious, catering primarily to traveling merchants and respectable visitors of modest means. Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, recognized Cassidy immediately. "Miss Fairchild." "It's been, 2 years?" she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron as they entered the small lobby. "And where is your dear father?" A shadow crossed Cassidy's face. "He passed away last month, Mrs. Holloway." "Oh, my dear girl." Genuine sympathy softened the older woman's features. "I am so sorry to hear that. Edward was a good man, one of the finest who ever stayed in my establishment." "Thank you," Cassidy said quietly. "We need lodging for a few days. 2 rooms if you have them available." Mrs. Holloway glanced between Cassidy and Darby with a raised eyebrow. "And this gentleman is?" "Darby Abernathy," he introduced himself with a respectful nod, "a business associate of the Fairchild family." Whether she believed this explanation or not, Mrs. Holloway simply nodded. "I have 2 rooms available on the 2nd floor." "Not adjoining, I'm afraid, one at each end of the hall. Will that suit?" "Perfectly," Cassidy assured her. "Very good. And how long will you be staying?" Darby and Cassidy exchanged glances. "We're not certain," Darby replied. "Perhaps a week, possibly longer. Our business in Denver is somewhat open-ended." Mrs. Holloway studied them for a moment, her experienced eye noting their trail-worn appearance and the careful way they watched the door. "I see," she said finally. "Well, I'll need payment for 3 days in advance. After that, we can arrange terms as needed." Once the financial arrangements were settled, Mrs. Holloway had a young porter show them to their rooms. Before they separated for the night, Darby and Cassidy agreed to meet early the next morning to seek out James Foster, the lawyer Cassidy had mentioned. Alone in her room, Cassidy allowed herself the luxury of a proper bath, washing away the dust and fatigue of their journey. As she soaked in the warm water, her mind turned over the events that had brought her here: her father's death, Hargrove's betrayal, and the unexpected arrival of Darby Abernathy in her life. In just a few days, he had become someone she trusted implicitly, a rare occurrence for a woman who had learned the hard way that most people looked out only for themselves. There was something about him, a quiet integrity, perhaps, or the way he had put himself at risk for her cause without hesitation, that stirred feelings she had thought buried beneath her grief and anger. Shaking off such thoughts as impractical distractions, she dried herself and changed into clean clothes provided by Mrs. Holloway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she needed to focus on the task at hand, proving Hargrove's crimes and reclaiming her family's legacy. Meanwhile, in his own room, Darby was engaged in similar reflections as he cleaned his revolver and checked their supplies. His involvement with Cassidy's plight had begun as a simple act of justice, helping someone who couldn't fight alone against a powerful opponent. But somewhere along the trail to Denver, it had become personal in ways he hadn't anticipated. He admired her courage, her determination to fight rather than accept defeat. The way she had gentled the wild mare still amazed him, revealing a patience and understanding that spoke volumes about her character. And there was a vulnerability beneath her strength that awakened protective instincts he'd thought long dormant. Pushing such thoughts aside, Darby focused on practical matters. Denver was Hargrove's territory as much as Cottonwood Springs, if Blue Wolf's information was correct. They would need to move carefully, gathering allies and evidence before making their case to the authorities. Morning came with a light dusting of early snow, unusual for October but not unheard of in the high country. Cassidy and Darby met in the hotel's small dining room for a breakfast of eggs, biscuits, and strong coffee before setting out to find James Foster's law office. "His practice is near the courthouse," Cassidy explained as they walked through the awakening city. "He specializes in land disputes and mining claims, exactly what we need." Foster's office was a modest but well-maintained building on a side street not far from the territorial courthouse. A brass plaque beside the door announced James Foster, attorney at law, in dignified lettering. A young clerk greeted them as they entered, looking up from a stack of documents. "May I help you?" "We'd like to see Mr. Foster, please," Cassidy replied. "My name is Cassidy Fairchild." "My father, Edward Fairchild, was a client some years ago." Recognition flickered in the clerk's eyes. "Of course, Miss Fairchild, please have a seat. I'll see if Mr. Foster is available." He disappeared through a door at the back of the office, returning moments later with a tall, slender man in his 50s. James Foster had the bearing of someone comfortable in courtrooms and boardrooms alike, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and prematurely white hair that contrasted with his relatively unlined face. "Miss Fairchild," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It's been some time. I was deeply sorry to hear about your father's passing. Edward was not just a client but a friend." "Thank you, Mr. Foster," Cassidy replied, shaking his hand. "This is Darby Abernathy, a friend who's been helping me with a rather serious matter." Foster shook Darby's hand with a firm grip, assessing him briefly before turning back to Cassidy. "Please, come into my office. Whatever brings you to Denver must be important." Once seated in Foster's well-appointed office, with the door closed for privacy, Cassidy recounted everything that had happened since her father's death, Hargrove's forged deed, her eviction from the ranch, and their journey to Denver with the evidence contained in the lockbox. Foster listened attentively, his expression growing increasingly grave as the story unfolded. When Cassidy finished, he removed his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Vernon Hargrove," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I should have known. This isn't the first time his name has crossed my desk in connection with questionable land acquisitions." "Then you believe us?" Darby asked. Foster replaced his spectacles, his gaze direct. "Without question. Edward Fairchild was one of the most honest men I've ever known. If he had genuinely wanted to sell the ranch, he would have done so openly and with proper legal counsel." He turned to Cassidy. "May I see these documents you've brought?" Cassidy placed the lockbox on his desk and opened it, carefully extracting the original deed and her father's correspondence with his authentic signatures. Foster examined them closely, comparing the handwriting with professional scrutiny. "These will be very helpful," he said finally. "But to build a case strong enough to stand against Hargrove, we'll need more. Specifically, we need a copy of the forged deed he's using to claim ownership of your ranch." "How do we get that?" Cassidy asked. "It would have been filed with the county recorder's office in Cottonwood Springs," Foster replied, "but I have contacts who can request a copy without arousing suspicion. It will take a few days." "We also heard that Hargrove might have a partner here in Denver," Darby added. "Someone with influence in the territorial government who helps smooth over his land grabs." Foster's eyebrows rose. "That would explain much about how he's managed to operate unchecked for so long." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "I have my suspicions about who that might be, but I'll need to investigate discreetly." "What should we do in the meantime?" Cassidy asked. "Stay out of sight as much as possible," Foster advised. "Hargrove has eyes everywhere, and if he discovers you're in Denver with evidence against him, he'll move quickly to neutralize the threat." He hesitated, then added, "In fact, it might be wise for you to stay somewhere other than a public hotel." "Do you have a suggestion?" Darby asked. Foster considered for a moment. "My sister owns a small house on the outskirts of town. She's currently visiting family in St. Louis and won't return for several weeks. It's isolated enough to provide privacy, but close enough to reach quickly if needed." "That would be ideal," Cassidy said gratefully. "We don't want to put Mrs. Holloway at risk if Hargrove's men come looking for us." "Precisely my concern," Foster agreed. "I'll have my clerk prepare the key and directions. You can move there this afternoon." He gathered the documents Cassidy had shown him. "With your permission, I'd like to keep these for now. They'll be safer in my office safe than carried around the city." Though reluctant to part with her father's papers, Cassidy nodded in agreement. "Just promise me they won't leave your possession." "You have my word," Foster assured her. "Now, I suggest you both return to your hotel, gather your belongings, and check out as inconspicuously as possible. Return here at 3 o'clock and I'll have everything arranged for your alternative accommodations." As they rose to leave, Foster added, "One more thing. It might be best if you avoid using your real name while in the city, Miss Fairchild. Hargrove has undoubtedly spread word to watch for you." The wisdom of this advice was proven sooner than any of them expected. As Cassidy and Darby walked back toward the Westward Hotel, they passed a saloon just as two rough-looking men emerged, deep in conversation. "Said to keep an eye out for a woman matching her description," one was saying. "Fairchild's daughter and some cowboy she's running with. Hargrove's offering $500 to anyone who brings them in." Darby subtly took Cassidy's arm, guiding her to the opposite side of the street while keeping his face turned away from the men. They continued walking at a measured pace, not too fast to draw attention but quick enough to put distance between themselves and the danger. "They're looking for us," Cassidy whispered once they were safely away. "Already? Hargrove works fast," Darby replied grimly. "Foster was right, we need to get out of that hotel immediately." Back at the Westward, they packed their few belongings quickly and settled their bill with Mrs. Holloway, explaining that unexpected business required them to change their arrangements. "I've been in this business long enough to know when folks are in trouble," the shrewd hotel owner said quietly. "If anyone comes asking after you, I never saw you leave. As far as I'm concerned, you're still in your rooms and not to be disturbed." Touched by the woman's perception and kindness, Cassidy embraced her. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. You're taking a risk for us." "Pshaw," the older woman scoffed. "I've dealt with worse than Vernon Hargrove's thugs in my time. You just take care of yourself, girl. Your father would want that." They left through the back entrance, leading their horses from the stable behind the hotel and making their way cautiously back to Foster's office by a circuitous route. The lawyer was waiting for them with a sealed envelope. "Inside you'll find the key and directions to my sister's house," he explained. "Also some cash, you may need it if you have to leave Denver quickly. I've taken the liberty of sending a messenger to a friend who can provide you with supplies without questions. How can we repay you for all this?" Cassidy asked. Foster shook his head. Your father once saved my practice when I was just starting out, extending credit when no one else would. Consider this partial repayment of an old debt." His expression grew serious. "Be careful, I'll send word as soon as I have anything useful." Following Foster's directions, they rode out of the city by secondary roads, heading toward the foothills where his sister's house stood. The journey took just over an hour, leading them to a modest but well-built cabin nestled among pine trees, with a small barn and corral behind it. "It's perfect," Cassidy said as they dismounted. "Isolated enough to be safe, but close enough to reach Denver quickly if needed." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It was clean and well-stocked with firewood and basic provisions, suggesting Foster had sent someone ahead to prepare for their arrival. As Darby tended to the horses in the barn, Cassidy lit the fire and explored the kitchen. The familiar domestic tasks helped calm her nerves, giving her something concrete to focus on instead of the uncertainty of their situation. By the time Darby returned, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, she had a pot of coffee brewing and was heating a simple stew from the provisions Foster had provided. "Smells good," he said appreciatively as he hung his coat by the door. "I checked the perimeter. We're well concealed from the main road, and there's a back trail through the woods if we need a quick escape." "Always thinking ahead," Cassidy observed with a small smile, setting 2 bowls on the rough-hewn table. "It's reassuring." As they ate, they discussed their next steps, agreeing that patience was necessary while Foster gathered the evidence they needed. But inaction didn't sit well with either of them. "I was thinking," Cassidy said, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with a finger, "about what Blue Wolf said regarding others Hargrove has wronged. Even if Foster finds evidence of the forgery, it would strengthen our case to have multiple victims testify." Darby nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned the Wilsons and Mrs. Tanner back in Cottonwood Springs. Do you know if they're still in the area?" "Mrs. Tanner moved to her daughter's home in Boulder," Cassidy replied. "But the Wilsons, last I heard, they had relocated to Denver after losing their mining claim. Jacob Wilson was trying to find work in the smelters here." "It might be worth trying to find them," Darby suggested. "If they're willing to speak against Hargrove, it could help establish a pattern of behavior." "I could go into the city tomorrow," Cassidy offered. "If I change my appearance a bit, I should be able to ask around without drawing attention." Darby frowned. "It's risky. Hargrove's men are looking for us." "They're looking for Cassidy Fairchild," she countered. "Not a widow named Mrs. Bennett, perhaps inquiring after old friends from home." She touched her honey-brown hair. "I could pin my hair differently, wear a veil. No one would look twice at a grieving widow." Darby still looked uncertain, but he recognized the determination in her eyes. "I don't like the idea of you going alone." "And you're too recognizable," she pointed out gently. "Your height alone would draw attention, and you've already confronted Hargrove face to face. I'll be careful, I promise." After further discussion, they agreed on a compromise. Cassidy would go into the city the following day disguised as a widow, with Darby following at a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. They would focus on locating the Wilsons, hoping to find allies in their fight against Hargrove. As darkness fell outside the cabin windows, a comfortable silence settled between them. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the simple room. For the first time in weeks, Cassidy felt something close to peace, not because their troubles were resolved, but because she was no longer facing them alone. "Tell me about the ranch," Darby said suddenly, his voice quiet in the firelit room. "What was it like growing up there?" The unexpected question brought a genuine smile to Cassidy's face. "It was wonderful," she said, her eyes growing distant with memories. "Freedom like you can't imagine. Miles of open country to ride across, new calves in the spring, wildflowers covering the hillsides in summer." As she spoke, the tension seemed to drain from her, replaced by animated descriptions of her childhood home, the secret swimming hole in the creek, the ancient cottonwood tree where she'd built a platform to watch for approaching riders, the way the mountains looked at sunset with the light turning them gold and purple. "My father taught me everything," she continued, her voice warm with affection. How to track, how to ride, how to manage the ranch hands with firmness and fairness. After my mother died when I was 12, it was just the two of us. We became partners as much as father and daughter. Darby listened, captivated by the picture she painted and the transformation in her as she spoke. The hardness that grief and injustice had carved into her features softened, revealing the vibrant young woman beneath. "It sounds like a good life," he said when she finally fell silent. "The kind worth fighting for." "It was," she agreed, her eyes meeting his across the table. And I will get it back." She hesitated, then asked, "What about your ranch in New Mexico? What's it like?" It was Darby's turn to grow reflective. "Smaller than yours sounds." "Just enough land for a modest herd and some crops. The house is simple 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but there's a view of the mountains that makes you believe in God again, especially at sunrise." "You built it yourself," he nodded, "every board and nail." "Took me 3 years, working between cattle drives to earn enough to add on bit by bit." "And you live there alone?" The question was tentative, personal in a way their conversations hadn't been before. "I have a few hired hands during calving season," he replied, sidestepping the deeper implication of her question. "The rest of the time it's just me and the cattle, simpler that way." "Simpler, yes," Cassidy said softly, "but lonely, I would think." Their eyes met again, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet cabin. For a moment, Darby seemed about to say more, but instead he rose from the table, breaking the spell. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Cassidy nodded, gathering the dishes as he added wood to the fire. They moved around each other with the easy rhythm of people who had quickly grown accustomed to sharing space, each anticipating the other's needs without discussion. As they retired to their separate bedrooms, Cassidy paused in her doorway. "Darby," she said, using his first name for the first time, "thank you, not just for helping me fight for the ranch, but for reminding me why it matters so much." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the shadowy hallway. "Get some sleep, Cassidy," he finally said, his voice gentle. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect for their venture into Denver. Cassidy had transformed herself with remarkable skill, her hair pulled severely back and covered with a black bonnet, her figure disguised by a shapeless mourning dress borrowed from Foster's sister's wardrobe, and a thick veil partially obscuring her face. She looked every inch the grieving widow, unrecognizable as the vibrant young woman who had fired a pistol in the Cottonwood Springs town square. "How do I look?" she asked, turning slowly for Darby's inspection. "Like someone entirely different," he approved. No one who knows Cassidy Fairchild would look twice at Mrs. Bennet. Their plan was simple but cautious. Cassidy would take the mare, now properly outfitted with a saddle and bridle from Foster's Provisions, and ride into the city ahead of Darby. She would inquire at the smelting works about Jacob Wilson, presenting herself as an old friend from Cottonwood Springs hoping to reconnect. Darby would follow at a distance, keeping watch for any sign of Hargrove's men. The city was busy when Cassidy arrived, the morning shift changing at the smelters and refineries that processed ore from the mountain mines. Men with soot-blackened faces streamed out of the massive buildings while others filed in to take their places, the air heavy with coal smoke and the acrid scent of chemicals. She approached a foreman who was checking names off a list as workers entered the largest smelter. "Excuse me, sir," she called, pitching her voice higher than normal and affecting a slight tremor. "I'm looking for Jacob Wilson. I was told he might work here." The foreman barely glanced up. "Wilson? Yeah, he's on day shift, been here about 8 months. He jerked his thumb toward a smaller building nearby. "Lunch shed. He'll be taking his break in about an hour." Thanking him, Cassidy moved away, finding a small cafe across from the smelting works where she could wait and watch. From her vantage point near the window, she could see the lunch shed, and the men gradually gathering there as their break time approached. She was so focused on watching for Jacob Wilson that she almost missed the 2 men who entered the cafe behind her, the same rough characters they had overheard outside the saloon the previous day. They took a table near the door, ordering coffee and speaking in low voices. Cassidy kept her face turned away, the veil providing additional concealment as she strained to hear their conversation. "Checked every hotel in town," one was saying. "No sign of them." "They're here somewhere," his companion insisted. "Hargrove says they'll be trying to reach the marshal or the circuit judge. We need to find them before they do." $500, the first man mused. That'd set a man up nice. Buy a little spread of his own, maybe. "If we don't find them soon, Hargrove's sending more men from Cottonwood Springs. Says he wants this problem handled before it gets bigger." Cassidy's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee, keeping her gaze fixed on the lunch shed across the street. The men continued their conversation, unaware that their quarry was sitting just feet away, hidden behind widow's weeds and a convincing disguise. Finally, she spotted a familiar figure among the workers gathering for lunch. Jacob Wilson, looking thinner and more careworn than she remembered, but unmistakable with his distinctive red beard and tall, lanky frame. Leaving money on the table for her coffee, Cassidy stood carefully, keeping her face averted from Hargrove's men as she made her way out of the cafe. Once outside, she crossed the busy street and approached the lunch shed, where workers sat on benches eating from lunch pails or purchasing simple fare from a counter at the back. "Mr. Wilson?" she asked quietly, approaching the man she'd recognized. "Jacob Wilson from Cottonwood Springs." He looked up with a frown, not recognizing her through the veil. "That's me. Do I know you, madam? May we speak privately?" she requested, gesturing toward a relatively quiet corner of the yard. "It's about Vernon Hargrove." At the mention of Hargrove's name, Wilson's expression hardened, but he nodded curtly and followed her to where they could talk without being overheard. "My name is Cassidy Fairchild," she said, lifting her veil just enough for him to see her face. "My father was Edward Fairchild. We had the cattle ranch outside town." Recognition dawned in Wilson's eyes. "Miss Fairchild, what are you doing in Denver and dressed like this?" Quickly, Cassidy explained her situation: Hargrove's forged deed, her eviction from the ranch, and her quest for justice. "I heard that you also had trouble with Hargrove," she concluded. "Something about your mining claim." Wilson's face darkened with anger. "That's putting it mildly. Hargrove claimed my strike overlapped with one of his existing claims, though my survey showed clear boundaries. When I disputed it, suddenly there were witnesses saying I'd moved my claim markers. Next thing I knew, the local magistrate ruled in Hargrove's favor, and I was left with nothing but debts." "Would you be willing to testify about this?" Cassidy asked eagerly. "We're building a case against Hargrove, gathering evidence of his pattern of fraud and intimidation." Wilson hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I've got a family to think about, Miss Fairchild. My wife and children depend on my wages here. If Hargrove found out I was speaking against him—" "I understand your concern," Cassidy assured him. "But imagine if enough people stood together. He couldn't retaliate against everyone." Still looking uncertain, Wilson said, "Let me think on it and talk to Martha, my wife. She has a right to have a say in a decision that affects our family." "Of course," Cassidy agreed. "Could we meet again tomorrow, same time?" After a moment's consideration, Wilson nodded. "Not here, though. Too many eyes and ears. There's a small church on Maple Street, St. Michael's. I'll meet you there at noon." As they concluded their conversation, Cassidy became aware of a commotion at the cafe across the street. Hargrove's men had emerged and were speaking animatedly with a third man who had just arrived on horseback. The new arrival was pointing in various directions, including toward the smelting works. "I need to go," she said urgently to Wilson. "I think I've been followed. Please be careful, and I'll see you tomorrow at St. Michael's." Keeping her head down, Cassidy moved quickly through the yard, heading away from the cafe and the men who were now crossing the street toward the lunch shed. She needed to find Darby and warn him that more of Hargrove's men had arrived in Denver. As she rounded a corner into a side alley intending to circle back to where she had left her horse, a hand suddenly grasped her arm. She gasped, reaching for the small derringer hidden in her pocket when a familiar voice spoke. "It's me," Darby said quietly, pulling her deeper into the shadows. "I saw them arrive," We need to leave the city now. I found Jacob Wilson, Cassidy told him as they moved swiftly through the alley. He agreed to meet tomorrow at St. Michael's Church to discuss testifying against Hargrove. That's good news, but we've got more pressing concerns, Darby replied grimly. The new arrival was one of Hargrove's foremen from the ranch. He'll recognize both of us, disguise or no. They reached the back street where they had left their horses, mounting quickly and setting off at a pace that wouldn't attract attention but would put distance between them and their pursuers. Only when they had left the city limits and were on the road back to Foster's sister's cabin did they allow themselves to relax slightly. They're closing in, Cassidy said, the reality of their situation settling heavily upon her. Hargrove must be truly worried about what we can prove if he's sending more men after us. Or truly angry, Darby suggested. Men like him hate being defied almost more than they fear being caught. Back at the cabin, they secured the horses in the barn and checked that nothing had been disturbed during their absence. Satisfied that their hideaway remained undiscovered, they settled in to discuss their next move. We should send word to Foster, Darby suggested, stoking the fire against the growing chill of evening. Let him know about the increased search efforts and your contact with Wilson. And about our meeting tomorrow, Cassidy added. If Wilson agrees to testify, we'll have our first corroborating witness against Hargrove. They drafted a message to Foster, keeping it deliberately vague in case it was intercepted. Using a code they had established with the lawyer, they indicated the new developments without explicitly mentioning names or locations. I'll ride partway into the city and find a messenger boy, Darby decided. It's too risky for either of us to go all the way to Foster's office now. While he was gone, Cassidy removed her widow's disguise and prepared a simple meal from their provisions. Her mind kept returning to Jacob Wilson's hesitation, his fear for his family's safety if he stood against Hargrove. How many others had been silenced by similar concerns? And how could she ask them to risk everything when she herself had so little left to lose? When Darby returned, they ate together in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead. As they cleared away the dishes, Darby finally spoke. I've been thinking about tomorrow's meeting. It's risky for you to go back into the city with Hargrove's men actively searching for us. We can't miss this opportunity, Cassidy countered. Wilson might be our only chance to establish a pattern of fraud by Hargrove. I agree we need to meet him, Darby clarified, but I think I should go instead of you. In your widow's disguise, with my hat pulled low, I could pass for a grieving husband at a distance. Wilson would recognize the deception up close, of course, but by then we'd be safely inside the church. Cassidy considered the plan. It had merit. Darby was less likely to be recognized in the widow's garb than she would be without it, and having him make the contact would keep her safely away from the city while Hargrove's search intensified. All right, she agreed finally, but be careful. Wilson is skittish. Approach him gently. I can be gentle when needed, Darby replied with a slight smile. The evening settled around them, quiet save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. Despite the dangers they faced, there was a growing comfort in their shared purpose and mutual trust, a partnership forged through adversity that was evolving into something neither had anticipated. What will you do when this is over? Cassidy asked suddenly, breaking the silence. When we've dealt with Hargrove and I have the ranch back, will you continue south to your place in New Mexico? The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Darby studied the fire for a long moment before answering. I haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. When I rode into Cottonwood Springs, I was just passing through. Now, he trailed off, looking up to meet her gaze. Now I'm not sure what comes next. You could stay, Cassidy said softly, the words out before she could reconsider them. The Fairchild Ranch always needs good hands, especially those who know cattle. Darby's expression was unreadable as he held her gaze. Is that what I'd be, a hired hand? The question was gentle but direct, forcing Cassidy to confront the feelings that had been growing between them, feelings she had been too focused on survival to fully acknowledge. No, she answered honestly. I think you'd be much more than that, Darby Abernathy, if you wanted to be. The tension in the room shifted, transforming from the wariness of fugitives to the awareness of a man and woman acknowledging an attraction neither had planned for. Darby moved from his chair to sit beside her on the small sofa, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him but not touching. I've spent the last 10 years avoiding attachments, he said quietly, telling myself it was simpler, safer that way. And now, Cassidy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I'm sitting here with a woman who fired a gun in the town square rather than accept injustice, he replied, a smile touching his lips. A woman who gentled a wild horse with a song and rode through mountain passes without complaint. A woman who disguised herself as a widow to seek justice not just for herself, but for others wronged by the same man. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a gentle pressure that sent warmth spreading through her. Now I'm wondering if simple and safe are overrated compared to brave and true. Cassidy's heart beat faster as she looked up at him, seeing in his clear blue eyes the same emotions tumbling through her own heart: admiration, attraction, and a tentative hope for something neither had been looking for. We've known each other less than a week, she said, though there was no conviction in the token protest. And yet I feel I know you better than people I've known for years, Darby replied. Perhaps because we've faced danger together. Or perhaps because some connections don't need time to form, they simply exist, waiting to be recognized. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strength in his jaw and the kindness in his eyes. Without conscious thought, Cassidy found herself leaning toward him, drawn by a force as natural and inevitable as gravity. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened, his hand rising to cup her cheek with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he possessed. It was a moment of connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together, not the desperate embrace of fugitives seeking comfort, but the genuine expression of two hearts recognizing a kindred spirit. When they finally parted, Cassidy remained close, her forehead resting against his. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now we continue our fight," Darby answered, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "We get your ranch back, we bring Hargrove to justice, and then—" He smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. "Then we see where this leads. Together." "Together," she echoed, the word a promise as much as an acknowledgement. The morning of their planned meeting with Jacob Wilson dawned with a sense of purpose tempered by caution. They had spent the previous evening refining their strategy. Darby would meet Wilson at St. Michael's Church, while Cassidy remained at the cabin, ready to flee if anything went wrong. "Remember," Cassidy said as she helped Darby adjust the widow's bonnet over his hat, "Wilson is cautious but fundamentally decent. Explain that we're gathering witnesses against Hargrove and that his testimony about the mining claim could be crucial." Darby nodded, looking decidedly uncomfortable in the morning dress that strained across his broad shoulders. "And if he's still hesitant, tell him we understand his concerns for his family's safety," Cassidy replied. "But remind him that if Hargrove isn't stopped, he'll continue to prey on honest people like the Wilsons. Sometimes the only way to end tyranny is to stand against it, even when it's frightening." Their eyes met, both recognizing that she was echoing the very reason Darby had stepped forward to help her in Cottonwood Springs, a refusal to stand by while injustice prevailed. "I'll be back by mid-afternoon," Darby promised, bending to kiss her briefly before mounting his horse. Cassidy watched him ride away, the incongruous sight of his masculine figure swathed in widow's black bringing a smile to her lips, despite the seriousness of their situation. Then, following their agreed-upon plan, she set about preparing the cabin for a quick departure if necessary, packing essential supplies and keeping the horses ready. The hours passed slowly as she waited, her mind cycling through scenarios both hopeful and dire. Would Wilson agree to testify? Would Hargrove's men discover their meeting? Had Foster made progress with obtaining the forged deed for comparison? The questions remained unanswered as the sun climbed toward its zenith, and then began its westward descent. When the sound of approaching hoofbeats finally reached her ears in mid-afternoon, Cassidy moved cautiously to the window, pistol in hand. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Darby returning alone, riding at a casual pace that suggested no immediate pursuit. "How did it go?" she asked anxiously as he dismounted in the yard. "Better than expected," Darby replied, already removing the cumbersome bonnet and dress as soon as he was inside the cabin. "Wilson was waiting as promised, and he's agreed to testify." "Truly?" Cassidy's face lit with hope. "What changed his mind?" "His wife, apparently," Darby said with a slight smile. "He discussed it with her last night, and according to Wilson, Martha said if there was a chance to see Hargrove get what he deserved, they couldn't pass it up even if it meant risk." "Brave woman," Cassidy murmured appreciatively. "There's more," Darby continued, now back in his regular clothing. "Wilson knows others who have had similar experiences with Hargrove, a storekeeper forced to sell at a loss, a rancher whose water rights were suddenly reinterpreted by the county after he refused Hargrove's lowball offer. He's willing to approach them quietly, see if they'll join in a formal complaint." "That's wonderful news," Cassidy exclaimed. "With multiple witnesses testifying to similar patterns of fraud and intimidation, the territorial authorities will have to act." "Wilson is meeting with Foster tomorrow to give a formal statement," Darby added. "And I received a message from Foster as well. He's obtained a copy of the forged deed from his contact in Cottonwood Springs. He says the forgery is obvious even to an untrained eye when compared with your father's genuine signature." For the first time since her father's death, Cassidy felt true hope blossoming in her chest. With solid evidence of forgery and multiple witnesses to establish Hargrove's pattern of criminal behavior, justice suddenly seemed possible rather than merely a distant dream. "How soon can Foster take this to the territorial marshal?" she asked eagerly. "He's preparing the formal complaint now," Darby replied. "Once he has Wilson's statement tomorrow, he plans to present everything to Marshal Reynolds the following day, and then, if Reynolds accepts the evidence as compelling which Foster believes he can issue an immediate injunction freezing all activity on the disputed properties, including your ranch. That would prevent Hargrove from selling off any more livestock or equipment while the case proceeds." Cassidy closed her eyes briefly, imagining her home preserved rather than dismantled. "And Hargrove himself, if the forgery is proven, he'll face federal charges," Darby said, his expression grim with satisfaction. "Fraud involving land deeds is a serious offense. He could spend years in prison." The possibility of such complete justice, not just regaining her property, but seeing Hargrove punished for his crimes, was almost overwhelming. Cassidy sank onto a chair, emotions warring within her. "I can hardly believe it," she whispered. "After everything that's happened, to think we might actually succeed." Darby knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "We're not there yet," he cautioned gently. "There's still risk. Hargrove won't go down without a fight, and we don't know who his partner in Denver might be." "I know," she acknowledged. "But for the first time, I can see a path forward, a real chance at justice, not just futile protests that no one heeds." He squeezed her hands. "Foster sent another message as well. He suggests we remain here out of sight until he's presented the case to Marshal Reynolds. It's safer and our presence isn't needed for this stage of the process." Cassidy nodded in agreement. "Did you see any sign of Hargrove's men in the city?" "They're still searching," Darby confirmed. "I spotted 2 of them watching the hotels near the courthouse, but they weren't paying attention to churches or mourners, thankfully." As evening approached, they shared a simple meal, the atmosphere lighter than it had been since their arrival in Denver. The progress with their case, combined with their newly acknowledged feelings for each other, created a sense of cautious optimism that had previously been absent. "Tell me more about your ranch in New Mexico," Cassidy said as they sat before the fire after dinner. "What's it really like?" Darby's expression softened as he described the land he had painstakingly developed over the years, the creek that ran year-round, the natural meadows perfect for grazing, the modest house he had built with his own hands. "It's nothing like the Fairchild Ranch," he admitted. Smaller, rougher around the edges, but there's good potential there. It sounds wonderful, Cassidy said sincerely, a place built through your own effort and vision. I always thought it was enough, Darby said, his eyes meeting hers. A quiet life, answerable to no one, beholden to nothing but the seasons and the needs of the cattle. He paused, a new vulnerability in his expression. Now I'm not so sure that solitude is what I want anymore. The admission hung between them, pregnant with possibilities neither had considered before their paths crossed in Cottonwood Springs. What are you saying, Darby? Cassidy asked softly. He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. I'm saying that plans can change. That sometimes what we think we want isn't what we truly need. His eyes held her steadily. I'm saying that meeting you has made me reconsider what matters most. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Cassidy, a place that had been wounded by loss and betrayal but was now healing, opening to new possibilities. I've been thinking too, she said, her fingers intertwining with his. About the future. About what happens after we win this fight. She took a deep breath. The Fairchild Ranch is my legacy, my home. I can't abandon it. I would never ask you to, Darby assured her. But, she continued, her voice gaining strength, a ranch that size needs more than one person to run it properly. It needs someone who understands cattle, who can manage men fairly, who sees the land not just as property but as a living trust. A slow smile spread across Darby's face as he understood what she was suggesting. Are you offering me a job, Miss Fairchild? I'm offering you a partnership, she corrected, returning his smile, in every sense of the word. The implications of her words were clear, not just a business arrangement, but a shared life, a future built together on the foundation of mutual respect and growing love that had developed between them. Darby's response was to draw her gently into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words could not promise, passion and a commitment that transcended their brief acquaintance. Yes, he said simply when they parted. To all of it, yes. The next 2 days passed in a strange blend of tension and contentment as they waited for word from Foster. Confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings for safety, they used the time to deepen their knowledge of each other, sharing stories of their pasts, discussing plans for the ranch's future, and exploring the connection that had formed so quickly between them. On the afternoon of the third day, the sound of an approaching rider brought them both to alert wariness. Darby positioned himself by the window, rifle ready, while Cassidy checked that the back door was unobstructed in case they needed to flee. The tension eased when they recognized Foster's clerk, Thomas, riding alone up the path to the cabin. The young man looked exhausted but triumphant as he dismounted. Mr. Foster sent me, he announced as Darby opened the door. I've ridden straight from his office with news. They ushered him inside, where Cassidy quickly provided water for both Thomas and his horse while Darby secured the perimeter. Marshal Reynolds has reviewed our evidence, Thomas reported once he had quenched his thirst. The forged deed, Wilson's testimony, and statements from 3 others who came forward after Wilson spread the word. The marshal was particularly interested in the pattern of fraud spanning multiple victims. And, Cassidy prompted, hardly daring to hope. He's issued an immediate injunction freezing all activity on the disputed properties, including the Fairchild Ranch, Thomas announced with a grin. Furthermore, he's dispatched deputies to Cottonwood Springs to prevent Hargrove from fleeing or destroying evidence. Cassidy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the implications sank in. The ranch is safe. Hargrove can't sell anything else. Nothing can be removed or altered until the case is resolved, Thomas confirmed. And given the strength of the evidence, Mr. Foster believes resolution will come swiftly and in your favor. What about Hargrove himself? Darby asked. A warrant has been issued for his arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and intimidation of witnesses, Thomas replied. The deputies should be taking him into custody as we speak. The news was everything they had hoped for and more. Justice was not only possible but actually in motion, the wheels of law turning against the man who had thought himself above it. There's one more thing, Thomas added, his expression growing more serious. Mr. Foster believes he's identified Hargrove's partner in Denver, a clerk in the land office named Jenkins, who has been approving questionable transactions for a cut of the profits. The marshal is investigating him as well. When can we return to the ranch? Cassidy asked, her mind already racing ahead to reclaiming her home. Mr. Foster advises waiting until word comes that Hargrove is in custody, Thomas cautioned, just to be safe. He expects that confirmation within 2 days, given the speed at which the marshal's deputies were traveling. After providing them with additional details and a written summary from Foster, Thomas departed, eager to return to Denver before nightfall. Alone again in the cabin, Cassidy and Darby absorbed the momentous news. "It's really happening," Cassidy said wonderingly. "We're going to win." Darby pulled her into his arms, his embrace solid and reassuring. "You never gave up, even when the entire town turned against you. That courage is why we're here now." "We're here because you stepped forward when no one else would," she countered, looking up at him with eyes bright with emotion. "When they said I wasn't wanted anymore, you said, 'You're all I've ever wanted,'" Darby finished softly, the words no longer just a strategic declaration made to confound the sheriff but a heartfelt truth. "And I meant it then, even if I didn't know it yet." Their kiss was a celebration of victory, of justice in sight, and of the unexpected gift they had found in each other amidst the struggle. 2 days later, a messenger arrived with the news they had been waiting for. Vernon Hargrove was in federal custody, arrested without incident at his office in Cottonwood Springs. The path was clear for them to return to the Fairchild Ranch. They departed immediately, leaving a note of thanks for Foster's sister, and setting out on the journey back to Cottonwood Springs with hearts full of anticipation. Riding side by side, Cassidy on Esperanza and Darby on his gelding, they covered ground quickly, eager to reach the ranch that would now be their shared home. As they crested the final rise overlooking the Fairchild Ranch 3 days later, Cassidy reined in her horse, emotion overwhelming her at the sight of the familiar buildings nestled in the valley below. Despite Hargrove's brief occupation, the place looked fundamentally unchanged, still the home she had loved, still the legacy her father had entrusted to her. "Welcome home," Darby said quietly, drawing his horse alongside hers. She turned to him, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "Our home," she corrected, reaching for his hand, "if you still want it to be." His answer was in the tenderness of his gaze and the strength of his grip as their fingers intertwined. More than anything. Together, they rode down into the valley, toward the ranch that would be the foundation of their shared future, a future built on courage, justice, and a love that had sparked in the unlikeliest of circumstances, but would burn steady and true for all the years to come. 6 months later, the Fairchild Ranch was thriving once more. The spring calving season had been successful, with a healthy crop of new additions to the herd. The hired hands who had been lured away by Hargrove had returned, drawn back by fair wages, and the respected Fairchild name now strengthened by Abernathy's steady presence. Vernon Hargrove had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and forgery, sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. His Denver accomplice, Jenkins, received a shorter sentence in exchange for testimony that helped recover stolen properties for several of Hargrove's victims. On a perfect June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the hillsides and cottonwood fluff floating like snow in the summer air, Cassidy Fairchild became Cassidy Abernathy in a simple ceremony on the ranch. Father Thomas performed the service, with Blue Wolf, the Wilsons, and other friends from both near and far gathered to witness the union. "She's not wanted anymore," someone had whispered as Cassidy walked toward her groom, remembering the cruel words that had once been spoken about her in the town square. Darby, hearing this, had smiled at his bride with all the love in his heart and declared for all to hear, "She's all I've ever wanted, all I'll ever need." And in the home they shared, the ranch they built together, and the family they would raise in the years to come, those words proved true beyond measure, a love born in adversity, strengthened through justice, and destined to last a lifetime.